sailing solo across the vast ocean, miles from shore. A pod of dorsal fins appeared on the horizon. Harmless dolphins, or so it seemed at first glance. The fins grew larger, approaching with unnatural speed. The sailboat rocked violently, nearly capsizing. A monstrous head rose from the depths, jaws agape. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the ORCA ATTACK story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The mist clung to the rugged Patagonian shore like a spectral shroud, obscuring the boundary between land and sea. Javier Mendoza stood at the water's edge, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. He surveyed his sleek red kayak with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This solo expedition into the remote fjords of Patagonia had been a dream of his for years. But now that the moment had arrived, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. "You've got this, Javier," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Just you and the sea like always." He began his final equipment check, meticulously going through each item. The routine was comforting, grounding him in the familiar even as he prepared to venture into the unknown. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, securing dry bags filled with supplies, checking the integrity of his life vest, and ensuring his emergency beacon was fully charged and easily accessible. As he worked, the sound of footsteps crunching on the pebbly shore caught his attention. He looked up to see Maria, the owner of the small guest house where he had stayed the night before, approaching with a thermos in her hand. "Buenos dias, Javier," she called out, her weathered face creased with concern. "I thought you could use some hot mate before you set out." Javier straightened up, smiling gratefully. "Gracias, Maria. That's very kind of you." He accepted the thermos, savoring the warmth that seeped into his cold fingers. Maria watched him with motherly worry etched across her features. "Are you sure about this, mijo?" she asked, gesturing towards the vast expanse of water before them. "The fjords can be treacherous, especially for someone alone. Perhaps you should wait for a guide." Javier shook his head, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I appreciate your concern, Maria, but this is something I need to do on my own. I've been planning this trip for years and I'm well prepared." Maria sighed, recognizing the resolve in his voice. "Very well, but promise me you'll be careful. The sea here, she has many moods and not all of them are kind." "I promise," Javier assured her, taking a sip of the hot bitter mate. The familiar taste bolstered his courage. "I'll return in a week with stories to tell." With a final nod of appreciation to Maria, Javier turned back to his kayak. He secured the thermos in one of the dry bags and took a deep breath, centering himself for the journey ahead. With practiced movements, he pushed the kayak into the water, feeling the first kiss of the cold sea against his hands. Javier settled into the cockpit, adjusting his spray skirt and gripping his paddle. He cast one last glance at Maria, who stood watching from the shore, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. "Vaya con Dios," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the sound of lapping waves. With powerful, practiced strokes, Javier propelled himself away from the shore. The misty veil seemed to part before him, revealing glimpses of the majestic landscape that lay ahead. Towering cliffs rose on either side of the fjord, their jagged peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. The water was a deep slate gray, reflecting the somber sky above. As he paddled further from shore, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rhythmic splash of his paddle and the occasional cry of a distant seabird. The solitude he had sought began to envelop him, both exhilarating and daunting in its totality. Hours passed as Javier made his way deeper into the fjord. The mist had lifted, revealing the full grandeur of his surroundings. Waterfalls cascaded down the cliff faces, their roar echoing across the water. Patches of hardy vegetation clung to the rocks, splashes of green against the predominant gray of stone and sky. As the sun climbed higher, Javier paused to take a drink of water and check his position on the waterproof map secured to the deck of his kayak. He was making good time, the favorable currents helping to carry him along. Just as he was about to resume paddling, A movement in the water caught his eye. About 100 meters ahead, a sleek black dorsal fin broke the surface, followed by another and then another. Javier's breath caught in his throat. Orcas. He had known they frequented these waters, but seeing them in person was an entirely different experience. Keeping his movements slow and steady, Javier reached for the small waterproof camera attached to his life vest. He snapped a few photos as the pod moved gracefully through the water, their black and white bodies gleaming in the pale sunlight. "Magnificent," he whispered, awe evident in his voice. The orcas seemed unperturbed by his presence, focused on their own journey through the fjord. Javier watched, transfixed, as they moved further away, eventually disappearing around a bend in the coastline. The encounter left Javier buzzing with excitement. He resumed paddling with renewed vigor, his earlier doubts forgotten in the wake of such a spectacular sight. The day wore on, the sun tracing its arc across the sky, occasionally obscured by banks of clouds rolling in from the Pacific. As afternoon began to fade into evening, Javier started to search for a suitable spot to make camp for the night. The cliffs had given way to slightly more forgiving terrain, with small rocky islands dotting the fjord. He scanned the shoreline, looking for a protected cove or a flat stretch of land where he could safely pull up his kayak and pitch his tent. Just as the light was beginning to take on the golden quality of sunset, Javier spotted a promising location. A small rocky island rose from the water about 50 meters from the main shoreline. Its surface seemed relatively flat, and a natural breakwater of rocks offered some protection from the waves. With careful maneuvers, Javier guided his kayak towards the island. As he drew closer, he could see a narrow strip of pebbly beach where he could land. The waves lapped gently against the shore, making the approach easier than he had anticipated. With a final push, the bow of his kayak scraped against the pebbles. Javier climbed out, his legs slightly wobbly after hours of sitting. He stretched, feeling the satisfying pop of his joints, before turning to secure his kayak. As he dragged the boat further up onto the shore, Javier couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He paused, scanning the water and the surrounding cliffs. The fjord seemed empty, the surface of the water undisturbed, save for the gentle ripples caused by the evening breeze. Still, a prickle of unease ran down his spine. "Get a grip, Javier," he chided himself. "It's just your imagination playing tricks on you." Pushing the feeling aside, he focused on setting up camp. He efficiently unpacked his tent, securing it on a relatively flat patch of ground a safe distance from the water's edge. As he worked, he couldn't help but cast occasional glances over his shoulder at the darkening water. With the tent erected and his sleeping bag laid out inside, Javier set about preparing a simple meal of dehydrated camping food. He fired up his small camp stove, the blue flame a comforting beacon in the gathering dusk. As he waited for his food to rehydrate, Javier sat on a rock looking out over the fjord. The last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, reflected in the calm surface of the water. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty, yet Javier couldn't fully shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. He thought back to the orcas he had seen earlier. While the encounter had been thrilling, he couldn't help but remember Maria's warning about the sea's many moods. As if in response to his thoughts, a splash sounded in the distance, too far away to see in the fading light. Javier shivered, suddenly aware of how alone he truly was in this vast, wild place. He turned back to his camp, the small circle of light from his headlamp a poor defense against the encroaching darkness and the unknown creatures that called these waters home. As he finished his meal and prepared to retire for the night, Javier made a mental note to be extra vigilant in the days to come. The beauty of Patagonia was undeniable, but he was acutely aware that he was a visitor in a world where nature reigned supreme, a world where even the most awe-inspiring sights could hide unseen dangers. With a final look at the now dark waters of the fjord, Javier zipped himself into his tent. The sounds of the night, the lapping of waves, the cry of a distant bird, the whisper of wind through rocky crags, surrounded him. As he drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with sleek black shapes moving through deep cold waters, their intentions as inscrutable as the depths themselves. The pre-dawn chill seeped through the fabric of Javier's tent, rousing him from a fitful sleep. He blinked away the remnants of unsettling dreams, fragments of dark shapes and churning waters lingering in his mind. As consciousness fully returned, so did the awareness of his surroundings. The hard ground beneath him, the sound of waves lapping at the shore, and an unfamiliar noise that had likely triggered his awakening. Splash. There it was again. Sound too substantial to be merely the gentle waves he'd fallen asleep to. Javier unzipped his sleeping bag and reached for his headlamp, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness of the tent, illuminating his breath in the cold air. He checked his watch. 5:17 a.m. The sun wouldn't rise for another hour at least. With cautious movements, Javier unzipped the tent flap and poked his head out. The world outside was a study in grays. The lighter shade of the sky barely distinguishable from the darker water and the black silhouettes of the surrounding cliffs. His small island was a deeper shadow against this backdrop. Splash. The sound came again, closer this time. Javier swept his headlamp across the water, the beam reflecting off the gentle waves. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a sleek, black shape broke the surface no more than 20 meters from shore. Javier's breath caught in his throat. An orca, its distinctive dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. It was unnervingly close to the island, much nearer to shore than he'd ever heard of these creatures venturing. Dios mío, he whispered, a mixture of awe and unease coursing through him. The orca submerged again, leaving barely a ripple. Javier scanned the water, trying to track its movement, but the predator had vanished into the depths. He waited, muscles tense for several long minutes, but the orca didn't resurface. Finally, with the sky beginning to lighten, Javier decided to emerge fully from his tent. He pulled on his dry suit with practiced efficiency, the neoprene a comforting second skin against the morning chill. As he worked, he kept his eyes on the water, half expecting the orca to reappear at any moment. Just curious, Javier muttered to himself, trying to quell the unease in his gut. They're intelligent creatures, probably just investigating something new in its territory. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that orcas were also apex predators, known for their complex hunting strategies. Pushing the thought aside, Javier set about breaking camp. He needed to cover a significant distance today if he wanted to stay on schedule. As he packed, the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the fjord in soft pinks and golds. The beauty of the scene helped to dispel some of his lingering anxiety. With his gear stowed and his kayak ready at the water's edge, Javier paused, for a moment, scanning the fjord one last time. The surface was calm, betraying no sign of the massive predator he'd seen earlier. Taking a deep breath, he pushed off from shore, settling into the familiar rhythm of paddling. For the first hour, Javier found himself hyper-aware of every ripple, every shadow in the water. But as the morning wore on and no sign of the orca appeared, he began to relax. The fjord widened, the cliffs on either side becoming less sheer, with patches of hardy vegetation clinging to their faces. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries echoing across the water. By midday, Javier had covered a respectable distance. He paused to consult his map, taking a swig from his water bottle as he did so. According to his calculations, he was making good time, perhaps even a bit ahead of schedule. Not bad, old man, he said to himself with a grin. Still got it. Just as he was about to resume paddling, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. He turned slowly, his heart rate quickening. There, no more than 50 meters away, was the unmistakable dorsal fin of an orca. As he watched, a second fin appeared beside it, then a third. A pod, Javier breathed, reaching for his camera with slightly trembling hands. He snapped several photos as the orcas surfaced and dove, their movements graceful despite their size. They seemed to be moving parallel to his course, neither approaching nor retreating. For nearly an hour, Javier paddled, keeping pace with the pod. He found himself talking to them, a mixture of Spanish and English tumbling from his lips. Beautiful, aren't you? Hermosos, but I bet you know that. They don't call you wolves of the sea for nothing. As if in response, one of the orcas breached, its massive body clearing the water entirely before crashing back down in a spectacular splash. Javier laughed, a sound of pure joy and amazement. Gracias for the show, he called out. But I think It's time for me to head to shore. You've got your path and I've got mine. Javier angled his kayak toward the nearest stretch of shoreline, a small, pebbly beach nestled between two jutting rocks. As he approached, he glanced back over his shoulder. The orcas were still visible, but they seemed to be moving away, their dorsal fins growing smaller in the distance. With a sense of relief mingled with a touch of regret, Javier beached his kayak. He climbed out, stretching his legs and rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness from hours of paddling. The sun was past its zenith now, the light taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. Javier dragged his kayak further up the beach, well above the tide line. As he secured it, a sudden splash made him whirl around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, no more than 10 meters from shore, was an orca. It rose partially out of the water in a behavior Javier recognized as spy hopping, a way for the animal to get a better look at things above the surface. For a moment, orca and man locked eyes. Javier felt pinned by that intelligent gaze, a gaze that seemed to be assessing him with an unsettling intensity. "Hey there," Javier said softly, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I thought you'd moved on." The orca remained in place for several long seconds before sinking back into the water with barely a ripple. Javier stood rooted to the spot, eyes fixed on where the creature had disappeared. Minutes ticked by, but the orca didn't resurface. Finally, with the sun dipping toward the horizon, Javier shook himself out of his trance. He needed to set up, camp, and prepare for the night. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes he would pause to scan the water, but the surface remained undisturbed. As darkness fell, Javier sat at the entrance of his tent, a mug of hot soup warming his hands. The events of the day played through his mind on a loop. The early morning sighting, the pod, and that final intense encounter. "You're reading too much into it," he told himself firmly. "They're curious, that's all. You're probably the first kayaker they've seen in these parts." But as he settled into his sleeping bag that night, Javier made sure his emergency beacon was within easy reach. The memory of that intelligent, assessing gaze followed him into his dreams, where dark shapes moved through deeper, colder waters, always just at the edge of his vision. In the depths of the night, a sound penetrated Javier's uneasy sleep, a long, haunting call that seemed to reverberate through the very rock of the shore. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that it was the call of an orca. As he lay there in the darkness, listening to the silence that followed that eerie call, Javier couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring challenges he wasn't prepared for. The sea, as Maria had warned him, had many moods, and he was beginning to fear he had stumbled into one of its darker ones. The first pale light of dawn found Javier already awake, his eyes gritty from a night of fitful sleep. The haunting orca call that had pierced the darkness still echoed in his mind, a phantom sound that refused to fade with the night. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening intently to the world outside his tent, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, the cry of a distant seabird, but no sign of the massive predators that had dominated his thoughts. With a deep breath, Javier unzipped his sleeping bag and began his morning routine. Every movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if by clinging to the familiar he could ward off the creeping sense of unease that had settled over him. As he emerged from his tent, the fjord lay before him like a sheet of burnished steel, reflecting the gradually brightening sky. Javier's eyes scanned the water, searching for any sign of disturbance, any hint of a dorsal fin breaking the surface. But the fjord remained stubbornly, almost unnaturally calm. "Just a normal day," Javier muttered to himself as he began to break camp. Nothing to worry about, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. There was nothing normal about the events of the past 24 hours, nothing routine about the intense scrutiny he'd felt from that spy-hopping orca. With his gear packed and his kayak ready at the water's edge, Javier paused. The logical part of his mind argued that he should continue his journey as planned. He was an experienced kayaker after all, and orcas were not known to attack humans in the wild, but a more primal part of him, the part attuned to the subtle shifts in the natural world around him, screamed danger. "Get a grip, Javier," he chided himself. "You can't let fear derail your entire expedition." Decision made, Javier pushed his kayak into the water and climbed in, securing his spray skirt with practiced movements. As he dipped his paddle into the water and pushed off from shore, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. For the first hour, the only sounds were the rhythmic splash of Javier's paddle and his own measured breathing. The fjord began to narrow, the cliffs on either side drawing closer, their jagged faces throwing long shadows across the water. Javier found himself paddling closer to the shoreline than usual, the proximity to land offering a false sense of security. It was then that he saw it. A sleek, black dorsal fin, cutting through the water no more than 50 meters away. Javier's breath caught in his throat as the orca surfaced fully, its massive body gleaming in the morning light. For a moment their eyes met, and Javier felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Easy," Javier whispered, as much to himself as to the orca. "We're just two travelers sharing the same road, see?" The orca submerged, disappearing from view. Javier increased his pace, his eyes darting constantly between the path ahead and the water around him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of his vulnerability in this vast, wild place. Suddenly, the orca surfaced again, this time much closer. Javier could see the individual scars on its skin, battle marks from a life spent in these unforgiving waters. The creature moved with a grace that belied its enormous size, easily keeping pace with Javier's kayak. "What do you want?" Javier found himself asking, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm not your prey. I'm not here to harm you." As if in response, the orca dove, its flukes lifting clear of the water before disappearing beneath the surface. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Javier's ragged breathing and the sound of water dripping from his raised paddle. 1 second passed. 2, 3. Javier's eyes scanned the water frantically, trying to anticipate where the orca might surface next. The tension was unbearable, every nerve in his body screaming for action, for escape. The impact, when it came, nearly capsized the kayak. The orca rammed it from below, lifting the stern clear of the water for a heart-stopping moment before it crashed back down. Javier clung to his paddle, knuckles white, as he fought to steady the craft. "Mierda!" he cursed, adrenaline surging through his veins. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." But it was happening. The orca surfaced again, this time so close that Javier could have reached out and touched it. Its eye, intelligent and inscrutable, seemed to bore into him, assessing, calculating. Javier knew he had to move, had to get to shore before the next attack. With powerful, desperate strokes, he propelled his kayak toward the nearest stretch of land, a small, rocky outcropping that jutted from the base of the cliff. The orca dove once more, and Javier braced himself for another impact. But seconds ticked by, and nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Javier's labored breathing and the splash of his paddle. Just as he began to hope that perhaps the orca had lost interest, a massive form exploded from the water directly in front of his kayak. The orca breached fully, its body arcing through the air in a display of raw power that sent spray showering over Javier. Time seemed to slow as the orca's massive body blocked out the sun, casting Javier in its shadow. He had a fraction of a second to appreciate the terrible beauty of the creature before instinct took over. Javier threw himself sideways, capsizing his kayak just as the orca crashed back into the water. The shock of the frigid water drove the air from Javier's lungs. He struggled to orient himself, the world a confusing swirl of bubbles and muted light. His dry suit protected him from the worst of the cold, but panic clawed at his mind, urging him to surface, to breathe. With a powerful kick, Javier broke the surface, gasping for air. His kayak bobbed nearby, upside down, the supplies he'd so carefully packed now floating in the water around him. But Javier had no time to lament the loss. His eyes scanned frantically for the orca, every second expecting to feel teeth closing around his leg, dragging him into the depths. The rocky outcropping he'd been aiming for was tantalizingly close, no more than 20 meters away. Javier began to swim, powerful strokes eating up the distance. His sodden clothes and boots dragged at him, but fear lent him strength he didn't know he possessed. 10 meters from shore, Javier felt something brush against his leg. He kicked harder, a strangled cry escaping his lips. The shore was so close, safety just beyond his fingertips. With a final, desperate lunge, Javier's hands found purchase on the slick rocks. He hauled himself out of the water, scrambling higher, up the outcropping on all fours, heedless of the sharp edges that cut into his palms. Only when he had climbed several meters above the waterline did Javier allow himself to collapse, his chest heaving as he gulped in great lungfuls of air. His entire body trembled, a combination of adrenaline, cold, and sheer terror. Slowly, Javier raised his head to look back at the water. His kayak was nowhere to be seen, likely carried away by the current. Of the Orca, there was no sign. The surface of the fjord was as calm and inscrutable as ever, betraying no hint of the drama that had just unfolded. As the immediate danger passed, the reality of Javier's situation began to sink in. He was stranded on a tiny outcropping of rock, his supplies and means of communication lost. The cliffs rose sheer behind him, offering no route of escape. And somewhere in the waters below, an orca waited, an apex predator that, for reasons Javier couldn't begin to fathom, had singled him out as prey. "Think, Javier. Think," he muttered to himself, running a shaking hand through his wet hair. "You've trained for emergencies. What's the first step?" But all his years of experience, all his careful preparation, seemed woefully inadequate in the face of this unprecedented situation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Javier huddled on his precarious perch, acutely aware of his exposure, of his vulnerability. And in the waters below, unseen but undeniably present, the hunt continued. The orca circled, patient and persistent, its intentions as opaque as the depths it called home. For Javier, the true test of survival was just beginning. The sun had reached its zenith, beating down on Javier's exposed position on the rocky outcropping. Despite the warmth of the day, he shivered intermittently, his wet clothes clinging to him like a second skin. Hours had passed since his narrow escape, yet the adrenaline still coursed through his veins, keeping him hyper-alert to every ripple in the water below. Javier's eyes scanned the fjord for what felt like the 1,000th time. The surface remained deceptively calm, offering no hint of the predator that lurked beneath. But he knew better than to trust that calm. Somewhere out there, the orca waited, its patience far outlasting his own. "What's your game?" Javier muttered, his voice hoarse from dehydration and fear. "Why me? Why now?" As if in answer to his questions, a sleek black dorsal fin broke the surface about 50 meters out. Javier's breath caught in his throat as he watched the orca glide effortlessly through the water, its movements a cruel parody of the grace he had admired just days before. The orca completed a lazy circle before submerging again, leaving Javier with a renewed sense of dread. He knew he couldn't stay on this rock forever. Already his muscles ached from the tension of maintaining his precarious position, and thirst clawed at his throat. "Think, Javier," he said to himself, running a hand through his salt-crusted hair. "There has to be a way out of this." He looked up at the sheer cliff face behind him. Climbing it was out of the question without proper equipment. To his left and right, the shoreline extended in a series of similar rocky outcroppings, none offering any better shelter or escape route than his current position. The sound of splashing drew his attention back to the water. The orca had resurfaced, closer this time. As Javier watched, it raised its head out of the water in a spy-hopping maneuver, its intelligent eye fixed directly on him. "What do you want from me?" Javier found himself shouting, frustration and fear overwhelming his usual calm. "I'm not your prey. Leave me alone." The orca sank back into the water without a sound, leaving Javier feeling foolish and even more vulnerable. He knew that anthropomorphizing the creature was dangerous, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with him, wearing him down psychologically before launching its final attack. As the afternoon wore on, Javier's situation became increasingly desperate. The sun, once a welcome warmth after his icy plunge, now beat down mercilessly, intensifying his thirst. His lips were cracked, his tongue feeling like sandpaper in his mouth. "Water. Water everywhere and not a drop to drink," he quoted bitterly, eyeing the vast expanse of the fjord. Just as Javier was considering the risks of trying to collect some seawater to rinse his mouth, a new sound caught his attention. At first he thought he was hallucinating, the steady thrum of an engine growing louder by the second. Hope surged through him as he spotted a small fishing boat rounding the bend of the fjord. Javier scrambled to his feet, ignoring the protest of his stiff muscles, and began waving his arms frantically. "Aquí! Ayuda!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Here! Help!" The boat altered its course, heading towards him. Javier could make out two figures on deck pointing in his direction. Relief washed over him in a dizzying wave. He was saved. But his relief was short-lived. As the boat drew nearer, a familiar, black shape surfaced between it and Javier's rocky refuge. The orca's dorsal fin cut through the water like a knife, its intent clear. "No, no, no," Javier moaned, watching in horror as the orca began to circle the approaching boat. The fishermen had spotted the orca. Javier could see them gesticulating, clearly arguing about how to proceed. The boat slowed, then came to a stop about 30 meters from Javier's position. "Please!" Javier shouted, desperation clear in his voice. "It's been after me for hours. You have to help." One of the fishermen, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hold on, amigo. We'll try to distract it." The other fisherman, younger and leaner, disappeared into the cabin, emerging moments later with what looked like a harpoon gun. Javier's stomach lurched at the sight. "No, don't hurt it," he found himself yelling, surprising even himself with the vehemence of his protest. The older fisherman waved reassuringly. "Tranquilo, it's just a flare gun. We'll try to scare it off." As if sensing the shift in dynamics, the orca suddenly surged forward, its massive body breaching the surface in a spectacular display of power. It crashed back into the water mere meters from the boat, rocking it violently. The younger fisherman stumbled, the flare gun discharging prematurely. The red flare arced over the water, missing the orca but casting an eerie glow over the scene. The acrid smell of smoke reached Javier even from his distant perch. For a moment everything seemed to pause. The orca had disappeared beneath the surface, the boat rocked gently in suddenly calm waters, and Javier held his breath, every muscle tense with anticipation. The attack, when it came, was breathtakingly swift. The orca erupted from the depths, directly beneath the boat, its enormous body lifting the stern clear out of the water. The two fishermen were thrown off balance, the younger one tumbling overboard with a panicked yell. "No!" Javier screamed, helpless to intervene as the scene unfolded before him. The orca ignored the floundering fisherman, focusing its attention on the boat. It rammed the vessel again, this time from the side. Javier could hear the crack of splintering wood even from his position. The older fisherman had managed to stay aboard. He was frantically trying to start the engine, but each impact from the orca sent shuddering vibrations through the boat, thwarting his efforts. In the water, the younger fisherman was swimming desperately for Javier's outcropping, his face a mask of terror. He was making good progress, his fear lending him speed. But the orca wasn't done. It completed another pass at the boat, this time striking it with its powerful flukes. The impact nearly capsized the vessel, sending up a spray of water and splinters. Javier's attention was torn between the struggling boat and the swimming fisherman. The man was close now, perhaps only 10 meters from safety. But as Javier watched, heart in his throat, he saw a familiar black shape gliding beneath the surface, heading straight for the swimmer. "Rapido, rapido," Javier shouted, reaching out as if he could somehow pull the man to safety through sheer force of will. The fisherman redoubled his efforts, his arms churning the water. 5 meters. 3. Javier could see the wild fear in the man's eyes, could hear his labored breathing. Just as the fisherman's outstretched hand grasped the edge of the rocky outcropping, the water behind him exploded. The orca's jaws clamped down on the man's leg, eliciting a scream of agony that would haunt Javier's nightmares for years to come. For one horrifying moment, man and beast were suspended in a terrible tableau, the fisherman clinging desperately to the rocks, the orca's massive body arched out of the water, its teeth sunk deep into human flesh. Then, with a sickening wrench, the orca pulled the fisherman back into the depths. The water churned red, a spreading stain that marked the man's final moments. Javier stared at the spot where the fisherman had disappeared, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He was dimly aware of shouting from the boat, of the sound of an engine sputtering to life. As shock gave way to the realization of what had just happened, Javier was overwhelmed by a wave of nausea. He retched, bringing up nothing but bile, his body shaking uncontrollably. When he finally looked up, the fishing boat was gone. Either fled or sunk. Javier couldn't be sure which. The fjord had returned to its deceptive calm, the ripples from the recent violence already fading away. And there, just offshore, the orca surfaced once more. It fixed Javier with that same inscrutable gaze, its black and white body now stained with streaks of red. In that moment, Javier knew with chilling certainty that his ordeal was far from over. The hunt continued, and he was the final prey. As twilight descended upon the fjord, Javier huddled on his rocky perch, his mind replaying the horrific events of the day in an endless, torturous loop. The fisherman's scream, the churning red water, the orca's cold, unflinching gaze. These images were seared into his consciousness, refusing to fade even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the chill seeping through Javier's still damp clothes and into his very bones. He shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard he feared they might crack. Hypothermia was becoming a very real threat, competing with dehydration and the ever-present danger lurking in the waters below. "Stay awake," Javier muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You fall asleep now, you might never wake up." He forced himself to move, ignoring the protest of stiff, aching muscles as he began to rub his arms and legs vigorously. The activity brought a small measure of warmth, but more importantly, it kept him conscious. As he moved, Javier's hand brushed against something in his pocket. His heart leapt as he realized what it was, his emergency beacon. In the chaos of the attack and its aftermath, he had completely forgotten about it. With trembling fingers, he pulled out the small device, saying a silent prayer that it had survived his earlier dunking. "Please work. Please work," he whispered as he pressed the activation button. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, miracle of miracles, a small red light began to blink steadily. Javier let out a sob of relief, clutching the beacon to his chest like a lifeline. "They'll come," he told himself, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "Someone will pick up the signal. You just have to hold on." But even as hope flickered to life within him, a familiar black shape broke the surface of the water. The orca was back, circling his rocky island with slow, deliberate movements. Its dorsal fin cut through the water like a shark's, a silent reminder of the danger that still lurked. Javier watched the predator's movements, a mixture of fear and grudging admiration coursing through him. Despite everything, he couldn't help but marvel at the orca's persistence, its single-minded focus on its chosen prey. "You don't give up, do you?" Javier found himself saying, his voice carrying across the still water. "What did I do to deserve such attention, eh?" The orca responded by spy-hopping, rising vertically out of the water until its eye was level with Javier's position. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other, an unspoken communication passing between them. In that instant, Javier understood with chilling clarity that this was more than just a hunt. It was a test of wills, a battle of endurance between two apex predators, one ancient and instinctual, the other armed with intelligence and technology, and only one would emerge victorious. As night fell in earnest, Javier's world shrank to the small circle of rock beneath him and the inky black water surrounding it. The orca had submerged, but Javier knew it was still out there, waiting. Every splash, every ripple sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system, keeping him in a state of constant, exhausting alertness. Hours crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Javier's throat burned with thirst, his stomach cramped with hunger. The cold had seeped so deeply into his body that he no longer shivered, a dangerous sign he knew, but one he felt powerless to combat. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Javier's mind started to play tricks on him. Shadows in the water took on monstrous shapes, and more than once he jerked awake from micro-sleeps, heart pounding, convinced he was falling into the orca's waiting jaws. "Stay focused," he told himself, his words slurring slightly. "Help is coming. You just need to hold on a little longer." But as the sun rose, painting the fjord in soft pinks and golds, there was no sign of rescue. The orca, however, made its presence known once more, surfacing close enough to the rock that Javier could have reached out and touched its sleek black skin. "What do you want from me?" Javier croaked, frustration momentarily overriding his fear. "Why won't you just leave me alone?" The orca's response was to open its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It wasn't a threat display, at least not entirely. Instead, it almost seemed like the creature was yawning. The absurdity of the situation struck Javier, and he found himself laughing, a harsh, broken sound that echoed across the water. "Are you bored?" he asked incredulously. "Is that it? Am I just entertainment for you?" The orca submerged again, leaving Javier alone with his increasingly scattered thoughts. The sun climbed higher, its heat a mixed blessing. While it helped to warm Javier's chilled body, it also intensified his thirst and hastened the onset of sunburn on his exposed skin. As midday approached, Javier's condition deteriorated rapidly. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen in his parched mouth. The world around him seemed to shimmer and waver, reality blending with hallucination. In his delirium, Javier began to see things, impossible things. The orca's eyes glowed with an eerie, intelligent light. Its fins elongated into arms, reaching for him across the impossible divide between water and air. At one point he could have sworn he heard it speak, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to bypass his ears and echo directly in his mind. "Come to us," it seemed to say. "Join us in the deep." Javier shook his head violently, trying to clear the vision. "No," he mumbled. "Not real. You're not real." But the voice persisted, a siren call that grew more tempting with each passing moment. The water, Javier realized, no longer looked threatening. Instead, it seemed cool and inviting, promising relief from the relentless sun and his burning thirst. "Just one sip," he told himself, inching closer to the edge of his rocky perch. "Just to wet my throat." Some last vestige of survival instinct screamed at him to stop, but Javier was beyond listening. He leaned out, one hand braced against the rock, the other reaching for the tantalizing surface of the water. Just as his fingers were about to break the surface, a new sound cut through his delirium, the distant but unmistakable whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades. Javier froze, hardly daring to believe it. He squinted against the sun, searching the sky. And there it was, a small dot on the horizon, growing larger by the second. "Here!" he tried to shout, but his parched throat produced only a feeble croak. Desperately, he waved his arms, praying that the helicopter's occupants would spot him. The orca, as if sensing that its time was running out, suddenly surged out of the water. Its massive body cleared the surface entirely, crashing back down, mere feet from where Javier sat. The impact sent a spray of icy water over him, shocking him back to full alertness. For a moment, Javier locked eyes with the creature. In its gaze, he saw something that he would spend years trying to understand. Not just hunger or predatory instinct, but a deep, alien intelligence. It was a look that seemed to say, "This isn't over." Then the orca was gone, disappearing beneath the waves just as the helicopter roared overhead. Javier looked up, squinting against the downdraft, to see a Coast Guard insignia on the chopper's side. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, cut through the noise of the rotors. "Stay where you are. We're sending down a rescue swimmer." Javier watched, tears streaming down his face as a figure rappelled from the helicopter. The rescue swimmer hit the water with a splash and began to make his way towards the rock. As the swimmer reached him, Javier felt the last of his strength give out. He slumped forward, caught by strong arms that began to secure him into a rescue harness. "I've got you," the swimmer said, his voice barely audible over the noise of the helicopter. "You're safe now." As Javier was lifted into the air, swinging gently in the harness, he managed to turn his head for one last look at the fjord below. There, just beneath the surface, he caught a glimpse of a familiar black and white form. The orca was watching him ascend, its intelligent eye fixed on him until the very last moment. Then, with a flick of its powerful tail, it disappeared into the depths, leaving behind only ripples on the surface of the water and an indelible mark on Javier's psyche. As the helicopter door closed behind him and medical personnel swarmed around him, Javier finally allowed himself to believe that his ordeal was over. But even as relief washed over him, he knew that the memory of those 3 days and the otherworldly intelligence he had encountered would stay with him for the rest of his life. The steady thrum of the helicopter's rotors faded into the background as Javier drifted in and out of consciousness. His body, pushed beyond its limits by days of exposure and stress, was finally shutting down now that the immediate danger had passed. Voices filtered through his haze, urgent but indistinct. Male, mid-50s, severe dehydration and early stages of hypothermia. The fluid started, warming blankets applied. Possible hallucinations, mental state unclear. Javier tried to focus to tell them about the orca, about the fisherman who had died, but his parched throat produced only a weak croak. A gentle hand touched his arm, and a face swam into view. A young woman with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "It's okay, senor," she said softly in Spanish. "You're safe now. Try to rest." But rest wouldn't come. Every time Javier closed his eyes, he saw the orca's intelligent gaze, felt the spray of icy water as it breached beside him. He jerked awake repeatedly, his heart racing, convinced he was back on that rocky outcropping. The helicopter touched, down with a gentle bump, and Javier was quickly transferred to a waiting ambulance. The flurry of activity around him was overwhelming after days of isolation. Paramedics rushed him into the emergency room of a small regional hospital, where a team of doctors and nurses immediately set to work. Hours passed in a blur of tests, treatments, and questions that Javier was too exhausted to fully comprehend, let alone answer. It wasn't until late that evening, as he lay in a hospital bed with an IV drip slowly replenishing his fluids, that Javier finally began to feel somewhat human again. A soft knock at the door roused him from a light doze. A man entered. Tall, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He wore the uniform of the Chilean Navy. "Señor Mendoza?" the man said, approaching the bed. "I'm Captain Alejandro Ruiz. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I need to ask you a few questions about what happened out there." Javier nodded weakly, gesturing for the captain to take a seat. As Ruiz settled into the chair beside the bed, Javier noticed the deep furrows in his brow, the tightness around his eyes. This was a man carrying a heavy burden. "First," Ruiz began, his voice gentle but firm, "I want you to know that you're not in any trouble. We're just trying to piece together what happened. Can you tell me about the fishing boat?" Javier closed his eyes, the horrible memory washing over him anew. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They were trying to help me. 2 men. The orca. It attacked their boat. One of them fell overboard. He almost made it to the rocks where I was, but..." Javier's voice broke, and he had to take a moment to compose himself before continuing. "The orca took him, right in front of me. There was so much blood." Captain Ruiz's face had gone pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his notepad. "Dios mío," he muttered. Then, clearing his throat, he asked, "And the other fisherman? The one who stayed on the boat?" Javier shook his head. "I don't know. The last I saw, the boat was badly damaged. The engine was struggling. And then, I'm sorry. Everything after that is a bit of a blur." Ruiz nodded, jotting down notes. "We found the boat," he said grimly. "Washed up on a beach about 10 kilometers south of where we found you. It was empty." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air between them. Javier felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his physical condition. 2 men dead because they had tried to help him. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. "Captain," Javier said, forcing himself to meet Ruiz's eyes, "I need you to understand. This wasn't a normal orca attack. It was purposeful, intelligent. It singled me out, followed me for days. It was like it was testing me, playing with me even. I know how that sounds, but I believe you." Ruiz interrupted, his voice low and intense. To Javier's surprise, there was no skepticism. In the captain's eyes, only a deep, troubled understanding. "You're not the first, Señor Mendoza." Javier's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" Ruiz glanced towards the door, as if to ensure they were still alone, then leaned in closer. Over the past few months, we've had several incidents in these waters. Boats damaged or sunk, divers going missing. And always there are reports of orcas behaving strangely, more aggressively than normal, more deliberately. But orcas don't attack humans, Javier protested weakly, even as he recalled the terrible events he had witnessed. Not usually, no, Ruiz agreed. But something has changed. We don't know if it's environmental factors or pollution or... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts were taking him. Or what? Javier pressed. Ruiz sighed heavily. There are some who believe that the orcas are evolving, for lack of a better term, becoming more intelligent, more aware, and perhaps more resentful of human encroachment on their territory. Javier remembered the orca's eyes, that deep, alien intelligence he had sensed. A shiver ran down his spine. What's being done about it? Officially? Very little, Ruiz admitted. The government doesn't want to cause a panic or damage the tourism industry. Unofficially, well, that's why I'm here. We're gathering data, trying to understand what's happening. Your account could be very valuable. Just then, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Raised voices, the sound of running feet. Ruiz stood, moving towards the door, but before he reached it, it burst open. A nurse rushed in, her face pale with shock. "Captain!" she gasped. "You need to come quickly. There's been another attack." Ruiz spun to face Javier, indecision clear on his face. Javier struggled to sit up, ignoring the protest of his battered body. "Go," he urged, "and be careful." With a quick nod, Ruiz hurried out, leaving Javier alone with his turbulent thoughts. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The idea that what had happened to him wasn't an isolated incident was both terrifying and, in a strange way, validating. He wasn't crazy. The threat was real. As the hours crept by, Javier drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams haunted by sleek black shapes and cold, intelligent eyes. He was roused sometime in the early hours of the morning by another knock at his door. Expecting to see Captain Ruiz, he was surprised when instead, a small, wiry man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses entered. "Senor Mendoza, I'm Dr. Eduardo Vega," the man introduced himself, pulling up a chair. "I'm a marine biologist specializing in cetacean behavior. Captain Ruiz asked me to speak with you about your experience." Javier eyed the newcomer warily. "Are you here to tell me I imagined it all? That it was just the delirium from dehydration?" Dr. Vega's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "On the contrary, Senor Mendoza, I'm here because I believe every word of your account, and I need your help to understand what's happening out there." For the next 2 hours, Javier recounted his ordeal in painstaking detail. Dr. Vega listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions that revealed a deep understanding of orca behavior, both normal and abnormal. "The level of persistence you describe is highly unusual," Vega mused, tapping his pen against his notepad. "Orcas are intelligent and curious, certainly, but this level of focused aggression towards a human, it's unprecedented." "It felt personal," Javier said softly. "Like it had chosen me specifically. Tested me, even." Vega nodded, his expression grave. "That aligns with other reports we've received. It's as if these orcas are selecting certain humans for interaction, often with tragic results." A chill ran down Javier's spine. "But why? What's changed?" Dr. Vega removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose tiredly. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have theories, of course. Changes in the marine ecosystem disrupting their food supply, increased boat traffic stressing the populations. But none of that fully explains the behavior we're seeing." He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. Finally, he leaned in, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's another possibility, one that most of my colleagues dismiss out of hand. But given what you've described, tell me, Senor Mendoza, do you believe in the possibility of non-human intelligence?" Javier's mind flashed back to those moments on the rock, when he could have sworn the orca was communicating with him somehow. "You mean, like alien intelligence?" Vega shook his head. Not necessarily extraterrestrial, but intelligence that has evolved right here on Earth, in an environment utterly alien to us. The oceans cover more than 70% of our planet's surface, and we've explored less than 5% of them. Who knows what kinds of intelligence might have developed in those vast, dark depths? The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Javier found himself shivering despite the warm hospital room. So you think, what? That these orcas are trying to communicate with us? Or test us? Vega said softly. Probe our defenses. Assess our capabilities. Much like how you described the orca's behavior towards you. A heavy silence fell between them as Javier grappled with the implications of this theory. Finally, he asked, what can be done? How do we communicate back? Make them understand we're not a threat? Dr. Vega's expression turned grim. That's the problem. Not everyone shares my view that communication should be our goal. There are those who see this as a threat to be eliminated. Even now there's talk of culls, of military intervention. Javier felt a surge of unexpected protectiveness. Despite everything he had been through, the idea of retaliating against these magnificent, intelligent creatures felt deeply wrong. We can't let that happen, he said firmly. Vega's eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and hope. You would be willing to help us? To share your experience? To advocate for a peaceful approach? Javier nodded without hesitation. Whatever it takes. I've seen firsthand what these creatures are capable of, both their power and their intelligence. If there's a chance to bridge this gap, to understand each other, we have to try. As dawn broke outside the hospital window, casting a warm glow over the room, Javier and Dr. Vega began to plan. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time since his ordeal began, Javier felt a glimmer of hope. He had survived his encounter with the orca not just by chance but for a reason, and he was determined to make that survival count. The pale light of dawn crept through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the floor. Javier sat on the edge of his bed, his legs dangling over the side, testing their strength. 3 days had passed since his rescue, days filled with medical tests, police interviews, and long discussions with Dr. Vega about the orca phenomenon. Now, finally, he was being discharged. As Javier carefully pulled on a set of borrowed clothes, each movement a reminder of his ordeal, a soft knock sounded at the door. Dr. Vega entered, his face etched with concern. Are you sure about this, Javier? He asked, not for the first time. You've been through a traumatic experience. No one would blame you for taking more time to recover. Javier shook his head, a determined set to his jaw. We don't have time, Eduardo. You said it yourself, the situation is escalating. If we don't act soon, we might lose our chance to communicate with them forever. Vega sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. I know. It's just, what we're proposing is incredibly risky. If anything were to happen to you, it won't, Javier said with more confidence than he felt. We've planned this carefully, and besides, I'm the best chance we have. I've interacted with them before. Maybe they'll recognize me. The doubt in Vega's eyes was clear, but he nodded reluctantly. All right. The boat is ready whenever you are. As they made their way through the hospital corridors, Javier could feel the eyes of the staff upon him. Word of his ordeal had spread quickly in the small coastal town, and he had become something of a local celebrity. A survivor of the killer whales, they called him in hushed tones. If only they knew the full truth. Outside, the crisp Patagonian air bit at Javier's skin, a stark reminder of the icy waters he would soon be facing again. A small crowd had gathered near the hospital entrance, held back by a couple of local police officers. As Javier emerged, a ripple of murmurs went through the onlookers. That's him, the one who survived the ORCA attack. Is he going back out there? Javier kept his head down, allowing Dr. Vega to guide him through the throng to a waiting car. As they pulled away, he caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, Captain Ruiz watching their departure with a mixture of concern and something that looked almost like anger. The drive to the small harbor was tense and silent. Javier's mind raced with doubts and second thoughts. Was he really ready to face the orcas again? What if he was wrong about their intentions? What if this was all just a product of his trauma-addled mind? As if sensing his unease, Vega spoke up. Javier, if you've changed your mind. No, Javier said firmly, as much to convince himself as Vega. We have to do this. It might be our only chance to prevent a catastrophe. They arrived at the harbor to find a small research vessel waiting for them. A team of marine biologists and acoustics experts were already aboard, making final preparations. Javier recognized a few faces from the meetings over the past days. Dr. Ana Cortez, a cetacean communication specialist, and Marco Soto, an expert in marine mammal behavior. As Javier boarded the vessel, he felt a familiar twinge of anxiety. The last time he had been on the water. He shook his head, forcing the memories away. This was different. He was prepared now, surrounded by experts and equipped with the latest technology. All set, Javier? Ana asked, handing him a wetsuit. We've got about an hour's journey to the site where the orcas were last spotted. Javier nodded, taking the wetsuit. As he changed, he could hear the low hum of conversation among the team, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This mission was unprecedented, an attempt to directly communicate with potentially aggressive orcas, using a combination of underwater speakers, hydrophones, and a brave, or foolish, human intermediary. As the boat pulled away from the harbor, Javier made his way to the stern, watching the coastline recede. The enormity of what they were about to attempt weighed heavily on him. If they succeeded, it could change humanity's relationship with the oceans forever. If they failed, well, he tried not to think about that. The hour-long journey passed in a blur of final preparations and safety briefings. Before Javier knew it, the captain was cutting the engine, allowing the boat to drift in the calm waters of the fjord. The cliffs rose around them, hauntingly familiar. We're here, Dr. Vega announced, his voice tight with tension. Hydrophones are picking up orca vocalizations nearby. They know we're here. Javier took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was it. No turning back now. He approached the side of the boat where a small platform had been lowered into the water. Ana was there, helping him into a harness attached to a safety line. Remember, she said, her eyes serious. At the first sign of aggressive behavior, we pull you out. No heroics, okay? Javier managed a weak smile. No heroics. Got it. With a final nod to the team, Javier lowered himself into the water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, bringing back a rush of memories from his ordeal. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. But then he heard Vega's voice through his earpiece, calm and reassuring. We've got you, Javier. You're doing great. Take a moment to acclimatize. Then give us the signal when you're ready to begin. Javier forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, focusing on the gentle lapping of waves against the boat's hull. Gradually, the initial shock of the cold water faded and he felt his racing heart begin to slow. Okay, he said finally. I'm ready. At his word, a low, haunting sound began to emanate from the underwater speakers. It was a carefully crafted sequence of tones and clicks based on months of research into orca vocalizations. The hope was that it would attract the orca's attention without seeming threatening. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Javier floated in the water, every sense on high alert. Then suddenly he felt it, a change in the water pressure, a subtle shift that sent chills down his spine. Movement detected on sonar. Marco's voice crackled through the earpiece. Large signature approaching from the southeast. Probable orca pod. Javier's heart began to race again. This was it. The moment of truth. He scanned the water around him, straining to catch a glimpse of the approaching creatures. Then, without warning, they were there. 3 massive dorsal fins broke the surface less than 50 meters away. Javier's breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of them. The scarred fin of the orca that had pursued him days ago. They're here, he whispered into his mic. 3 of them, including the one from before. The orcas began to circle, their movements slow and deliberate. Javier remained as still as possible, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to flee. Through his earpiece, he could hear the excited chatter of the research team, analyzing the orca's behavior in real time. Suddenly, the scarred orca broke from the circle, approaching Javier directly. Time seemed to slow as the massive creature drew near. Javier could see its eye. That same intelligent, inscrutable gaze that had haunted his dreams. "Hold steady, Javier." Vega's voice came through, tense but controlled. "It's showing curiosity, not aggression. This is good." The orca came to a stop mere meters from Javier, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it. For a long moment they regarded each other in silence. Then, to Javier's astonishment, the orca opened its mouth. But instead of the attack Javier half expected, a series of clicks and whistles emerged. The vocalizations were unlike anything he had heard before. More complex, more deliberate. "Are you getting this?" Javier asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're recording everything," Anna replied, excitement evident in her tone. This is unprecedented. It's almost as if it's trying to talk to me," Javier finished, encouraged by this apparent attempt at communication. Javier slowly raised his hand, palm outward, in what he hoped would be seen as a non-threatening gesture. The orca watched, its gaze never leaving Javier's face. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, the orca mirrored the gesture. It raised its pectoral fin, holding it steady in a clear imitation of Javier's hand. "Oh my God," someone gasped, over the comlink. "Are you seeing this?" Javier's mind reeled. This was far beyond anything they had anticipated. This wasn't just intelligence. This was a clear, deliberate attempt at cross-species communication. Emboldened, Javier slowly moved his hand in a wave. The orca followed suit, its fin moving in a similar pattern. Back and forth they went, a surreal dance of human incitation. "Javier," Dr. Vega's voice cut through the excited chatter. "We're going to try playing back some of the vocalizations we just recorded, see how it responds." A moment later, the underwater speakers came to life, replaying the complex series of clicks and whistles the orca had produced. The effect was immediate. All three orcas perked up, their attention fully focused on Javier and the boat. The scarred orca moved even closer, its massive body dwarfing Javier. Then, to everyone's amazement, it began to vocalize again, but this time the sounds were clearly an attempt to mimic the playback. It's trying to match the recording," Anna said, her voice filled with wonder. "This is communication. Javier. Real, two-way communication." For the next hour, Javier remained in the water as the team played various recordings and tones, each eliciting different responses from the orcas. It was clear that they were not just reacting, but actively engaging, even seeming to correct the playbacks when they weren't quite right. As incredible as the experience was, Javier could feel exhaustion and cold beginning to set in. Just as he was about to signal that he needed to come out of the water, something changed. The scarred orca, which had been closest to him throughout the encounter, suddenly tensed. "Javier," Marco's urgent voice came through the earpiece. "We're picking up new signatures on the sonar, fast-moving, heading this way." Before Javier could respond, the water around him erupted into chaos. The three orcas began vocalizing loudly, their calls sharp and aggressive. In the distance, Javier could hear the roar of approaching boat engines. "Multiple vessels incoming," the captain's voice reported. "Military by the look of them. They're hailing us, demanding we clear the area immediately." Panic gripped Javier. This was exactly what they had feared. Official intervention that could destroy any progress they had made. "We can't leave now," he shouted. "We're on the verge of a breakthrough." But even as he spoke, he could see the orcas beginning to retreat. The scarred one lingered a moment longer, its eye meeting Javier's one last time. In that gaze, Javier saw something that would haunt him for years to come. A mixture of intelligence, sadness, and what he could only describe as a farewell. Then, with a powerful flick of its tail, the orca dove deep, disappearing into the dark waters of the fjord. The others followed suit, leaving Javier alone in the suddenly empty sea. "Javier, we have to go." Vega's voice was urgent. "Those ships will be here any minute. We can't risk them confiscating our data." Numbly, Javier allowed himself to be pulled from the water. As the research vessels sped away, he caught a glimpse of sleek gray military boats entering the fjord. But his eyes were drawn to the water, searching for any sign of the incredible creatures he had just communicated with. There was nothing. The orcas were gone, vanished as quickly and mysteriously as they had appeared. But Javier knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that this was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's relationship with the intelligent life that shared our planet. As the cliffs of the fjord receded into the distance, Javier made a silent promise. He would tell their story. He would make the world understand. And somehow, someday, he would find a way to bridge the gap between their worlds once and for all. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Javier Mendoza stepped onto the weathered dock of Puerto Natales. The small Patagonian town was just beginning to stir, fishermen readying their boats for the day's work, cafes opening their doors to early risers. But for Javier, it felt like a lifetime had passed since he'd last walked these streets. 6 months had elapsed since that fateful day in the fjord, when he'd made contact with the orcas. 6 months of debriefings, scientific analysis, and heated debates. 6 months of nightmares and therapy sessions. 6 months of fighting to be heard, to make people understand the significance of what had happened. As Javier made his way through the awakening town, his steps slow and measured, he couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that had led him back here. The aftermath of their encounter with the orcas had been chaotic. The research team had barely made it back to port before they were descended upon by a mix of government officials, military personnel, and overeager journalists. Dr. Vega and the others had been whisked away for intense questioning, their equipment and data confiscated for national security reasons. Javier, still reeling from the experience and weakened by his time in the icy waters, had found himself at the center of a media storm. Everyone wanted a piece of the man who had communicated with killer whales. The stories ranged from sensationalized accounts of a heroic survivor to wild conspiracy theories about alien intelligence lurking in Earth's oceans. Through it all, Javier had clung to the truth of what he'd experienced. The intelligence in those eyes, the clear attempt at communication, the mirroring of his gestures. These weren't the actions of mindless beasts or alien entities. They were the behaviors of highly intelligent, curious beings trying to bridge a gap between species. But convincing others of this truth had proven to be an uphill battle. Javier's musings were interrupted as he reached his destination, a small nondescript building on the outskirts of town. A weathered sign above the door read, Centro de Investigación Marina del Sur, Southern Marine Research Center. This modest facility had become the unofficial headquarters for their continued research into the orca phenomenon. As Javier entered, he was greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and the low hum of computers. Dr. Ana Cortez looked up from her workstation, a tired smile spreading across her face. "Javier, you're early," she said, rising to greet him with a warm hug. "How was your trip?" Javier returned the embrace, feeling some of the tension leave his body. Ana had been a steadfast ally throughout this ordeal, her expertise in cetacean communication proving invaluable. "Long," he replied with a sigh, "but necessary. The conference in Santiago was challenging." Ana's expression turned sympathetic. "Still a lot of skepticism?" Javier nodded, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "You could say that. Half the scientific community thinks we're delusional, the other half wants to turn the orcas into lab subjects. And don't even get me started on the military stance." Before Ana could respond, the door burst open, admitting a flurry of activity in the form of Dr. Eduardo Vega. The marine biologist looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes wild with a mixture of excitement and frustration. "Ah, Javier, excellent timing," Vega exclaimed, barely pausing for breath. "You need to see this. We've made a breakthrough in analyzing the vocalizations from that day." Intrigued, Javier followed Vega to a bank of computers. Screens displayed complex waveforms and spectrograms, the visual representation of the orca's calls. "We've been working around the clock," Vega explained, his fingers flying over the keyboard, cross-referencing every known orca vocalization, running the sounds through every analysis tool we could get our hands on. "And look at this." He pulled up a series of images, each showing a different spectrogram. "These are normal orca vocalizations," he said, indicating the first few. "Complex, yes, but following patterns we've observed before, but this..." He pointed to the last image, which showed a much more intricate pattern. This is what we recorded that day in the fjord. Javier leaned in, studying the image. Even to his untrained eye, the difference was striking. The pattern was more structured, almost symmetrical in places. It's not random, Anna chimed in, her voice filled with awe. There are repeating elements, variations on a theme. It's almost like language, Javier finished, a chill running down his spine. Vega nodded vigorously. Exactly. We're not just dealing with communication here, Javier. This is full-blown structured language. The complexity rivals some human languages. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Javier sank into a nearby chair, his mind reeling. Have you shared this with anyone else? He asked. Vega's excitement dimmed slightly. Not yet, we wanted to be absolutely certain before we went public, and he hesitated, exchanging a glance with Anna. And we're not sure who we can trust, Anna finished. After what happened with the military intervention, we need to be careful about who gets this information. Javier nodded grimly. The memory of those military boats charging into the fjord, scattering the orcas, still filled him with anger and regret. They had been so close to a true breakthrough, only to have it snatched away by fear and bureaucracy. So what's our next move? Javier asked, looking between his two colleagues. Vega took a deep breath, his expression turning serious. We need to go back out there, Javier. We need more data, more interactions, and... He paused, seeming to brace himself. We think you need to be the one to make contact again. Javier felt his heart rate quicken. The idea of returning to those waters, of coming face to face with the orcas again, filled him with a mixture of excitement and dread. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was too dangerous, that he had already pushed his luck too far. But a deeper part of him, the part that had locked eyes with that scarred orca and felt a connection beyond words, knew that Vega was right. When? Javier asked simply. As soon as possible, Anna replied. We've been tracking orca movements in the area. There's a pod that's been frequenting the fjords where we had our encounter. If we're going to do this, it needs to be soon before they move on. Javier stood, pacing the small room as he wrestled with the decision. The risks were enormous. If anything went wrong, it could set back human-orca relations by decades, not to mention the personal danger. He still woke up in cold sweats, reliving the terror of those days stranded on that rocky outcropping. But the potential rewards, if they could establish real communication, if they could prove to the world that these creatures were not just intelligent, but possessed of a complex language and culture, it could change everything. Our relationship with the oceans, our understanding of intelligence itself, all of it could be transformed. All right, Javier said finally, turning to face his colleagues. Let's do it. But this time we do it on our terms. No military, no government interference, just us and the orcas. Vega and Anna exchanged a look, a mixture of relief and apprehension on their faces. We'll need to move quickly and quietly, Vega said. I have a contact who can provide us with a boat. Off the books, we'll need to gather supplies, equipment. As they began to plan, a knock at the door interrupted them. All three froze, exchanging worried glances. They weren't expecting anyone else today. Anna moved to answer, opening the door cautiously. To everyone's surprise, Captain Alejandro Ruiz stood on the threshold, still in his naval uniform. Captain, Javier said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. This is unexpected. Ruiz stepped inside, his expression grim. I apologize for the intrusion, but we need to talk, all of you. It's about the orcas. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Javier moved protectively towards the computers, acutely aware of the valuable data they contained. What about them? Vega asked, his tone carefully neutral. Ruiz sighed, suddenly looking much older and more tired than Javier remembered. There's been another incident. A fishing trawler was attacked yesterday, about 50 kilometers south of here. 2 crew members were killed. The news hit like a physical blow. Javier felt his knees weaken, grateful for the chair behind him as he sank into it. Are you sure it was orcas? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Ruiz nodded grimly. Multiple witnesses plus video footage from a nearby vessel. It was definitely orcas, and it was definitely a deliberate attack. The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't an isolated incident anymore. It wasn't a curious orca testing boundaries. This was something else entirely. The government is under immense pressure to act, Ruiz continued. There's talk of deploying acoustic deterrence even calls. No! The word burst from Javier with such force that everyone in the room jumped. They can't do that. They don't understand what's happening here. Ruiz held up a placating hand. I agree, which is why I'm here, off the record. He glanced meaningfully at each of them. I know you've been continuing your research. I know you've made progress in understanding these creatures. I need to know what you know. For a long moment, silence reigned in the small office. Javier looked to Vega and Ana, seeing his own conflict mirrored in their faces. Could they trust Ruiz? Could they afford not to? Finally, Vega spoke. What we're about to show you doesn't leave this room. Agreed? Ruiz nodded solemnly. You have my word. Over the next hour, they laid out everything they had discovered. The complex vocalizations, the evidence of structured language, the clear signs of higher intelligence than anyone had previously attributed to orcas. Ruiz listened, intently, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. So you're saying these aren't just animals acting on instinct, he said slowly. These are sentient beings? With their own language, their own culture? That's exactly what we're saying, Javier confirmed. And more than that, they're trying to communicate with us. The encounter in the fjord wasn't an attack, it was an attempt at dialogue. Ruiz rubbed his temples, visibly struggling with the implications. But if that's true, then why the attacks? Why kill those fishermen? A heavy silence fell over the room. It was the question they had all been grappling with, the dark cloud hanging over their discoveries. We don't know, Ana admitted. It could be retaliation for perceived threats to their territory. It could be a misunderstanding, a cultural clash. Or they could be declaring war, Javier finished quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with portent. Ruiz stood pacing the small room as he processed everything he'd heard. This changes everything, he said finally. But it also makes our situation more precarious. If word of this gets out before we fully understand what's happening, the panic could be catastrophic. Javier leaned forward, his eyes intense. Which is why we need to go back out there. We need to establish communication, to understand their motivations. It's the only way to prevent a disaster. Ruiz stopped pacing, fixing Javier with a piercing gaze. You want to go back? After everything that's happened? We have to, Javier insisted. We're the only ones who have made contact. We might be the only ones who can prevent this from escalating into something we can't control. For a long moment, Ruiz said nothing, his internal struggle visible on his face. Then with a deep sigh, he seemed to come to a decision. All right, he said. I can't officially sanction this, you understand? But I can give you a window. 48 hours where I guarantee no naval patrols in the area you designate. After that, I can't promise anything. Relief washed over Javier. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Thank you, Captain. We won't waste this opportunity. As Ruiz prepared to leave, he turned back, his expression grave. Be careful out there, all of you. And Javier, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Remember that your first duty is to humanity. No matter how intelligent these creatures are, no matter how fascinating, if it comes down to us or them. It won't come to that, Javier interrupted firmly. I won't let it. After Ruiz's departure, the team sprang into action. There was much to prepare and precious little time. As Vega and Ana busied themselves with gathering equipment and supplies, Javier stepped outside, needing a moment to clear his head. The sun was high now, the small town fully awake. Life went on as normal, people going about their day unaware of the momentous events unfolding around them. Javier watched a group of children playing in the street, their laughter carried on the salty breeze, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. What they were about to attempt could change the course of human history. If they succeeded, it could open up a new chapter in our understanding of intelligence and our place in the world. If they failed, Javier shuddered to think of the consequences. As he stood there, lost in thought, a familiar voice called out to him, "Javier? Javier Mendoza?" He turned to see Maria, the owner of the guest house where he had stayed before his ill-fated kayaking trip. She approached, her weathered face creased with concern. "Maria!" Javier greeted her, forcing a smile. "It's good to see you." She studied his face, her eyes narrowing. "You're going back out there, aren't you? After those creatures?" Javier blinked in surprise. "How did you—" Maria waved a hand dismissively. "This is a small town, Javier. People talk, and I've seen that look before, on the faces of fishermen before a dangerous voyage, on climbers about to tackle an impossible peak." Javier sighed, not bothering to deny it. "I have to, Maria. There's too much at stake." The old woman was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting out to the distant waters of the fjord. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost reverent. "There are old stories in my family passed down for generations. Stories of the people of the sea, creatures of great power and wisdom. My grandmother used to say that they were not just animals but guardians of the ocean, keepers of ancient knowledge." Javier listened, fascinated. Could there be some kernel of truth in these old legends? Some ancestral memory of contact with these intelligent beings? Maria turned back to him, her eyes intense. "If you're going to face them again, you must go with respect, Javier, and with an open mind. They are not like us, but that doesn't mean they are less than us. Remember that." With those cryptic words, she pressed something into his hand. A small, smooth stone etched with strange symbols. "For luck," she said with a wink before turning and walking away, leaving Javier to ponder her words. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, the team made their final preparations. The boat Vega had secured was small but well-equipped, loaded with the latest in marine research technology. They worked in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the momentous task ahead. Just as they were about to cast off, a figure came running down the dock. It was Marco Soto, the marine mammal behavior expert who had been part of their original expedition. "Wait!" he called out, breathless. "I'm coming with you!" Javier exchanged a glance with Vega and Ana. They hadn't included Marco in their plans, worried about involving too many people. "Marco," Vega began hesitantly, "this is going to be dangerous. We can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Marco interrupted. "I'm telling. I've been tracking orca movements, analyzing behavior patterns. You need me on this trip." After a moment's hesitation, Javier nodded. "All right. Welcome aboard." As they pulled away from the dock, Javier stood at the stern, watching the lights of Puerto Natales recede into the distance. The weight of Maria's stone was heavy in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the mystique and danger that lay ahead. The first few hours of their journey passed in tense silence, each member of the team absorbed in their own preparations. Javier found himself drawn to the bow of the boat, scanning the dark waters ahead. Every splash, every ripple sent a jolt of anticipation through him. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Marco called out from his station at the sonar equipment. "I've got something. Large signatures moving fast, heading straight for us." The team rushed to their positions, a mixture of excitement and apprehension palpable in the air. Javier felt his heart rate quicken as he donned his wetsuit, his hands shaking slightly as he checked his equipment one last time. "Remember the plan," Vega said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We attempt communication from the boat first. Javier, you only enter the water if we get clear, non-aggressive signals from them. Ana, you're on vocalization playback. Marco, keep tracking their movements." Javier nodded, moving to the side of the boat. The weight was excruciating, every second stretching into eternity as they scanned the waters for any sign of the approaching orcas. Suddenly, the sea before them erupted in a spectacular display of power and grace. 3 orcas breached simultaneously, their massive bodies clearing the water entirely before crashing back down in a spray of white foam. The sound was thunderous, echoing off the cliffs of the fjord. "Madre de Dios," Ana whispered, her eyes wide with awe. As the orcas surfaced again, closer this time, Javier felt a jolt of recognition. There, leading the pod, was the scarred, orca from his previous encounter. Its distinctive dorsal fin cut through the water like a knife heading straight for their boat. "It's them," Javier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They remember us." The orcas began to circle the boat, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no aggression in their behavior, but the sheer power and intelligence radiating from them was enough to keep everyone on edge. Anna activated the underwater speakers, sending out the series of clicks and whistles they had carefully prepared based on their analysis of the orca's language. For a moment, there was no response. Then, to everyone's amazement, the scarred orca positioned itself directly beneath the speakers and began to vocalize. The sound that emerged was unlike anything they had heard before. It was complex, modulated, almost musical in its cadence. The team listened in rapt attention as the vocalization continued for nearly a minute before tapering off. "Did we get that?" Vega asked urgently. Marco nodded, his eyes glued to his equipment. "Every second. It's incredible. The complexity is off the charts." Javier felt a surge of excitement. This was it. Clear, unmistakable attempts at communication. He turned to Vega, his eyes alight with determination. "I need to get in the water. Now." Vega hesitated, studying the orca's behavior intently. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we pull you out at the first sign of trouble." With practiced movements, Javier secured his safety line and slipped into the water. The cold was shocking, but he barely noticed it. His attention entirely focused on the massive creatures circling nearby. For a moment, everything was still. Javier floated, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, waiting. Then, with a grace that belied its enormous size, the scarred orca approached. Time seemed to slow as orca and man faced each other once again. Javier found himself lost in that intelligent, inscrutable gaze. There was recognition there, he was certain of it, but there was something else too. An urgency, a desperation that he couldn't quite understand. Slowly, carefully, Javier raised his hand in the same gesture he had used during their last encounter. The orca watched, motionless, for a long moment. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, it raised its pectoral fin, mirroring Javier's movement perfectly. "It remembers." Anna's voice came through Javier's earpiece, filled with wonder. This is unprecedented." Encouraged, Javier began to move his hand in more complex patterns. Each time the orca followed, its movements becoming more fluid, more precise with each repetition. It was as if they were developing a language of gesture and movement, a bridge between their two worlds. But just as Javier felt they were on the verge of a breakthrough, something changed. The orca suddenly tensed, its gaze shifting to something behind Javier. A series of sharp, urgent clicks filled the water. "Javier, we've got incoming." Marco's voice crackled through the earpiece, tense with alarm. "Multiple boats approaching fast, military vessels." The spell was broken. The orcas began to circle agitatedly, their vocalizations taking on a frantic quality. Javier felt a surge of frustration and anger. They had been so close, only to be interrupted once again. "No," he muttered. "Not this time." Making a split-second decision, he unclipped his safety line. "Javier, what are you doing?" Vega's voice was sharp with alarm. "We need to go now." But Javier wasn't listening. He locked eyes with the scarred orca once more, trying to convey his intentions through sheer force of will. Then, taking a deep breath, he dove. The world beneath the surface was a realm of muted blue, shafts of sunlight piercing the depths, like spotlights. Javier swam deeper, his eyes scanning for any sign of the orcas. For a moment he saw nothing but empty water, and a tendril of fear began to curl in his gut. Had he made a terrible mistake? Then, suddenly, they were there. The pod surrounded him, their massive bodies dwarfing his own. But there was no threat in their presence. Instead, Javier felt an overwhelming sense of acceptance. The scarred orca positioned itself directly in front of Javier, its eye level with his own. As Javier watched, transfixed, something extraordinary began to happen. The water around them seemed to shimmer and distort, and images began to form in his mind. He saw vast underwater canyons teeming with life. He saw orcas hunting, playing, communicating in ways he could barely comprehend. He saw polluted waters, shrinking ice, caps dwindling food sources. He saw boats and nets, sonar pulses that caused pain and disorientation. And then, most incredibly of all, he saw himself. Through the orca's eyes, he witnessed their first encounter, felt its curiosity and fascination. He experienced its frustration at their inability to fully communicate, its determination to bridge the gap between their species. The visions came faster now, a dizzying whirlwind of images and sensations. Javier began to understand, with a clarity that transcended language, the orcas' motivations. Their attacks hadn't been acts of aggression, but desperate attempts to protect their territory, their young, their very way of life, from what they perceived as an existential threat. As the flow of images began to slow, Javier felt a profound sense of connection, of shared purpose. The orcas weren't so different from humans. They loved, they feared, they fought to protect what was theirs. But they also possessed a wisdom born of millennia in the seas, a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all oceanic life. With a start, Javier realized he was running out of air. His lungs burned, his vision beginning to darken at the edges. But before he could panic, he felt himself being pushed upward. The orcas surrounded him, gently but firmly guiding him back to the surface. As Javier broke the surface, gasping for air, he was immediately pulled back onto the boat by his worried teammates. In the distance, he could hear the roar of approaching engines, the military vessels closing in fast. "Javier, what happened? Are you all right?" Vega's face swam into focus, etched with concern. Javier nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "I'm fine," he managed. "Better than fine. I understand now. I know what they want, what they're trying to tell us." Before he could explain further, a deafening boom split the air. Everyone ducked instinctively as a warning shot whistled overhead. "This is the Chilean Navy," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "You are in a restricted area. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded." Javier struggled to his feet, his eyes scanning the water. The orcas had vanished, driven away by the noise and commotion. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As the military vessels drew alongside their small boat, Javier felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He knew what he had to do now. The orcas had entrusted him with their message, their plea for understanding. It was up to him to make the world listen. "It's going to be okay," he said to his worried teammates as uniformed officers began to board their boat. "This isn't over. It's just the next chapter." As he was led away for questioning, Javier's hand brushed against the stone in his pocket. Maria's gift. He smiled, remembering her words about the guardians of the ocean. She had been right, in ways she couldn't have imagined, and now it was time for humanity to listen to those guardians, before it was too late. The military officers might be ending this expedition, but Javier knew that the real journey, the journey towards understanding and coexistence with these incredible creatures, was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.